Good morning here from Mexico City. I'm very happy to participate in the GFN 2020 online conference. The title of my talk will be Nicotine Use, the Consequences of Bad Science for Consumers. You can see my name and affiliation in the slide, and I take the opportunity to declare that I have no conflict of interest. Now, let's see situation before the COVID-19 pandemic. We had the EVALI crisis in the USA. This meant deliberate misinformation and fear-mongering on vaping, which was spread by the CDC, most of the public health establishment, and the media in the USA. Unfortunately, this misinformation was echoed globally. And this was seen in many polls. Like, for example, in one of these polls, you can see that 66% of adult Americans thought incorrectly that EVALI was caused by Juul and nicotine vaping devices. Unfortunately, only 28% of the polled individuals thought correctly that this disease, this surge of disease, was caused by illegal THC vape pens, not by nicotine. Now, let's move fast forward to the current COVID-19 pandemic. Here we have a situation in which consumers are in stressful conditions, under isolation, lockdowns, and economic hardship. And on top of this, they are subjected to tons and tons of misinformation on vaping that is spread by most, let's say not all, health authorities. Now, this, of course, varies from country to country. It's worse in some countries, it's better in other countries. The situation of vapers also can deteriorate further if access to gear and consumables becomes too difficult. This is a likely effect of the pandemic, the lockdowns and economic hardship. And again, this varies very widely from country to country. For example, in some countries, Italy, France, New Zealand, Germany, health authorities are less hostile to vaping. Electronic cigarettes were deemed essential products, and vape shops were not closed during lockdown. In other countries, surprisingly the UK, vape shops were closed. Now, in countries like, for example, the USA, Canada, Australia, health authorities are more hostile. Anti-THR academics and anti-vaping NGOs have used the pandemic to press governments to, for example, to enact flavor bans, which was sadly successful in New York, and also to harden regulation, as happened in some Canadian provinces, right? So, again, now, what can we do about all this, about the rampant misinformation given to consumers under stressful conditions? Well, what we can do is to provide them with accurate and veridic information. Information is a powerful weapon. In general, consumers do not read, nor have access, nor understand, or maybe don't even care about scientific articles. So, as an effort to provide consumers under COVID lockdown access to scientific information, my colleague Carmen Escric, who is a virologist, and myself wrote and spread in social networks a rigorous scientific fact sheet summarizing available evidence on vaping, smoking, and COVID-19. Our writings were very well received and spread through social networks, so we think that we did a very good job sending to many vapers information on evidence. Now, let's see, what are the issues propagated by bad science that worry consumers, the key issues? First and foremost, warnings by public health authorities that vaping, which is typically lumped together with smoking, is a major risk for COVID-19 infection and serious disease. Another thing that worries is the possibility, which has not been tested, that bans could be enacted to prevent SARS-CoV-2 virus transmission. This would be a serious concern if you are vaping under lockdown. Another problem that worries consumers is the vacuum of information. There is no data on whether vapers are infected, hospitalized, or seriously ill. Finally, a lot of authorities deny the emerging evidence of the possible protective effect of nicotine, which will be treated extensively by Dr. Farsalinos. Now let's deal with these issues. Is vaping a major risk factor for COVID-19? What is the main argument behind this claim? The existence of a large literature reporting and mounting evidence that vapor favors or causes respiratory infections and inflammation. And this will put vapers at serious risk since COVID-19 primarily affects the respiratory system. This is the argument. Now, which studies report this evidence? Mostly, we're talking about laboratory studies in cell cultures, animal models. Also, about 20 more or less lab studies on tissues, typically, for example, sputum, extracted from respiratory system of human vapors. Then there is a few cross-sectional population studies relating vaping with asthma and COVID. And then there's a couple of deeply flawed longitudinal studies by Glantz and co-workers, which should be retracted by the journal. Now, most of these studies have been cited and summarized in various extensive academic reviews by anti-THR academics. For example, the review by Gotts et al. And the review by the European Respiratory Society. This literature receives widespread global diffusion and coverage by government health institutions, CDC, FDA, NIDA, Surgeon General in the USA, the WHO, medical societies, but most importantly, the diffusion is given by prominent anti-THR academics like Professor Glantz from University of California at San Francisco. These academics spread the literature to even wider audiences like popular science or especially the mainstream media, New York Times, CNN, Bloomberg media. If you see an academic being interviewed or featured or CNN comments, it is most likely, almost certainly, they are based on what Glantz wrote in his blog, and Glantz himself has taken the information from the reviews. So it's a wide circle. Now, how robust is this argument that vaping is a major risk for COVID on the grounds that I explained before? Actually, it's quite weak. First, it's completely speculative. There is no empiric basis for it. There is no record of vapors among hospitalized and seriously ill COVID-19 patients, as opposed to other comorbidities and smoking. If vaping was really a serious factor, a serious risk factor, then why there is no record of vapors among those hospitalized and seriously ill? We should see hundreds of them, hundreds of vapors in COVID wards. Where are they? Well, you can argue that vaping was not registered because of the confusion and the stress and everything by the pandemic, but this could explain a few cases, but not a massive amount of cases if vaping was really a serious risk factor. Now, what are the weaknesses of the studies that support this argument? I'm going to concentrate on all studies done on humans, whether tissues or human subjects through population studies. First, they're cross-sectional. That means they have a very limited predictive power. Then, typically, the laboratory studies are based on small samples of vapors, all of whom are either smokers or former smokers. This is a huge confounding factor that is not properly handled in these papers. The observed biological damage, therefore, is most likely due to large previous smoking history than recent vaping. And also, we find in these studies, in these articles, distorted risk communication. The studies report acute effects from idealized laboratory studies as if they were, as if these effects would pose chronic harm and with clinical consequences. This is completely speculative and unwarranted. Most importantly, these studies ignore counter-arguments, sources that report different outcomes. And here I can say various types of prospective cohort studies and randomized controlled trials that have directly followed and clinically examined vapers, typically for 1 year, but up to 3.5 years, and have not found high prevalence, especially high prevalence of respiratory infections and inflammations. And here are some examples of reviews and randomized controlled trials. And these are very serious works, and they're not even cited by the literature that I described before. So we have a case in which the argument is stronger than the counter-argument is stronger than the argument, because observations from prospective longitudinal studies undertaking clinical evaluation completely override these highly idealized lab studies on cell cultures, animal models, and human tissues, and they also override cross-sectional population studies. So what we have is this situation. It's case closed. Vaping as a risk factor for COVID-19 rests on very weak and speculative evidence. Another possible bad science case that could affect consumers, as I mentioned before, is the claim that special interventions, bans, might be needed to prevent transmission of the virus through exhaled vapor. Is there a need for special interventions? Well, let's look at the facts. First, there is no evidence that SARS-CoV virus transmission has actually happened through exhaled vapor or even through smoke, but this transmission is plausible. It's not impossible that it can happen. Airborne transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus is through saliva and secretion droplets, but it's important to mention that the droplets are not the viruses. The droplets in their nuclei contain viral particles, which are typically 100 nanometer size, very small. So a droplet can carry hundreds or even thousands of viruses. For all known viruses, normal breathing, either through the mouth or nose, is a mechanism of low spreading rate of droplets. You are spreading by this maybe 1 or 2 droplets per second, but remember, droplets can carry many viruses. There is increasing evidence that the droplets containing the SARS-CoV-2 virus are larger than 5 microns. Droplets of this size settle to the ground before evaporating and hardly reach 2 meters. When vocalizing, coughing, or sneezing, that's a different scenario. Much more droplets are spread into larger distances. For example, droplet nuclei of less than 5 micron, which happen when the droplets evaporate, remain airborne for longer times. However, vocalizing, coughing, and sneezing have no relevance for the issue we're dealing, which is the possible virus transmission through exhaled vapor. Why? Well, because it's impossible to exhale vapor and talk, cough, or sneeze at the same time. Thus, breathing is the right reference. Bioaerosols, like the ones we are dealing, consist of much fewer particles, which are droplets, than non-biological aerosols. As a consequence, the contribution of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to the flow dynamics of exhaled vapor is negligible. Some figures here. Virus transmission through breathing, we're talking about between 0.5 to 1 saliva droplets per cubic centimeters. On the other hand, exhaled vapor, we're talking about 10,000 to 100,000 propylene glycol and glycerol droplets per cubic centimeters. So it's a huge difference. Now, Saliva droplets from an infected vapor would be transported by exhaled vapor, which is a low-speed, mildly turbulent flow comparable to mouth breathing. Laboratory tests show that maximal detection range of exhaled vapor is between 1.5 and 2 meters for high-power devices and about 60 to 80 centimeters with low-power devices, always in the direction of the exhaled vapor plume. An infected vapor then would release through each puff roughly the same amount of droplets and viral particles as when he or she is breathing. Like we're talking about 1 to 5 droplets and hundreds of to thousands of viral particles per puff, but it's the same, more or less, roughly the same orders of magnitude as when breathing. Therefore, we can say that there is no need for special recommendations on exhaled vapor that would be different or more strict than those recommended to non-vapers and non-smokers to prevent mutual contagion from their breathing without a face mask. And just to keep a social separation distance of 2 meters from the vapors, or maybe even a little bit less, 1.5 meter, if the vapor is vaping with a low power device. Face masks would eliminate completely the risk. In fact, we can argue that infected vapor would transmit more viruses while breathing, which is done all the time, than by exhaled vapor, which is done only when vaping. Okay, some references that you can consult later. And again, what we have here is case closed. No special interventions needed to prevent SARS-CoV-2 contagion through exhaled vapor. Now, in trying to fill the vacuum of information, there was a study to probe the prevalence of COVID-19 in vapers, smokers, and non-consumers of nicotine under lockdown through an internet cross-sectional survey involving 3,517 participants. This was done by physicians from the University of Barcelona. Here is a paper that has been submitted to Journal of Medical Internet Research, and let's see the main results. First, the reported SARS-CoV-2 infection diagnosis involved 3.9% of all vapers, 4.7% of all smokers, and 10.2% of all non-consumers of nicotine. The latter, the non-consumers of nicotine, reported infection more than twice as much as vapers and smokers. There was a negative correlation between either smoking or vaping and infection, and thus the study supports a protective effect of nicotine use. However, this needs to be further corroborated by more complete studies. This is just like the first step on this direction. Future perspective, there is an urgent need to investigate the presence of vapors among the infected, hospitalized, and seriously ill COVID-19 cases. Also, psychological effects of lockdown on vapers and smokers. And also, most importantly, the possible protective effect of nicotine, but on vapers and snus users, not only on smokers, which this has been done, but there's need to do it for vapors and snus users. There is a very relevant ethical issue that I need to mention, and is the fact that those producing and propagating bad signs must be made aware of and be accountable for unintended perverse consequences of the signs that they are doing, because this affects real life consumers, it's real people. It's not just an academic issue. And unintended consequences, well, for example, many vapers could turn back to smoking, more so if gear becomes inaccessible or flavor bans are enacted. Many smokers could be deterred to try or to switch to much safer nicotine delivery products and will continue smoking. And also, for example, committed vapers might continue vaping, but could be forced to acquire gear and consumables through black markets or informal sources without quality control. Thanks for your attention.